So let's finally move on to the last part of our conversation today, and it's dyslexia. And I must say that when I made an announcement in my wiki group about you, and that you said rather avoid the word expert, yeah, but you are knowledgeable about dyslexia. I had a lot of questions from my subscribers, from teachers, because they really wanted some help and advice, yeah, and that's why we're going to talk a bit about it. So for those people who, like me, have not the slightest idea about it, can you briefly define the state, or like what is the right way of saying it?
Well, the terminology changes. The latest thinking is to call it, we have SLDs, and the latest thinking is SLDs, specific learning difference, to try and make it positive. Before they would have used the word specific learning difficulty, and before that maybe specific learning disorder. So what's happened is, just to try and look at it in a more positive way, we tend to use the word specific learning difference these days. What is it? Well, it's a very big question. I'll try and summarise what it is. We associate dyslexia with affecting literacy, reading and writing. That's kind of the tip of the iceberg. The way it affects literacy is one of the symptoms, if you like, of dyslexia. There's much more to it. It's basically grounded in working memory, people's working memory, people's ability to focus, people's ability to keep their attention in all walks of life. Not just reading and writing, but I'm sure you can imagine that as a child, as you're learning to read and to write, if you have problems with focus, if you have problems with maintaining attention, if you have problems with working memory, and I'll just explain what working memory is in a moment, you can see how that makes it difficult to learn and read and write at the same pace as your peers. Working memory is basically your ability to hold information in your mind long enough to perform an operation and produce a result. So for example, a simplification, but if as a child you're learning a new word, you spell it out, but you maybe start to forget the beginning of the word before you've reached the end. So it's very difficult to retain the information to produce a whole. It's a very complex issue, but that's broadly what it is. It's working memory and focus are probably the two things at the heart of dyslexia.
Sort of hereditary, genetic, or?
Well, it can be hereditary. I see a lot of things appearing on my social media pages online. Dyslexia is hereditary. No. Dyslexia can be. I think the latest thinking is that possibly over half, 60, possibly 70% of cases, it's hereditary. But we can't say it is hereditary, because it can be. For example, and just to digress, my interest, I was just saying to Paulina, my interest and my understanding of dyslexia comes from having a severely dyslexic son. And there is no history of dyslexia anywhere else in my or his mum's family. So he's a classic case of it's not hereditary. So please be aware when people make these bold claims about dyslexia, they're well intentioned, but approach them with caution. So it can be hereditary, but it's not necessarily hereditary.
Right. So what are the needs of such learners? Children, teens, adults?
Well, their prime need, I think, is understanding and support from their teachers, from their peers, and of course from their family. And I think the number one thing, as you can imagine, it can be very, very, very frustrating for dyslexic learners. And I think we as teachers, if we put it into a classroom context, need to be aware of that, and we need to have patience, understanding, and as much empathy as we can with the dyslexic learner. So that, I think, is number one, just an awareness that they're going to have difficulty. Then there are all sorts of strategies and accommodations that we can use in the classroom. For example, broadly we can maybe help them with reducing the processing load. So again, if we go back to this prime cause that a learner has problems with focus, with attention, with working memory, the more they have to deal with, the more difficult it is. The less they have to deal with, the more successful they can be. So in terms of materials, we can adapt materials. You know, if it's a long reading text of say 400 words, we can possibly cut it down carefully to 250. So there's less to deal with. If it's a grammar exercise with say 8 items, we can maybe reduce it to 5 or 6. And so on and so on. So there's some practical accommodations we can make. Extra time. I mean, for example, if a dyslexic learner was to do the IELTS exam, they would get an extra, I think, 25% of time. Back in the UK.
So it's official in the procedure?
Yes,
okay.
I believe. Back in the UK, I'm thinking of my son when he was at the school, just a regular state school in the UK, he was giving an extra 25% for his exams. However, to him, that was an extra 25% of torture. So giving this extra time isn't necessarily the best thing. For some learners, it could be the perfect accommodation. For other learners, you know, it could just be compounding the difficulty. It's a complex issue. It's a mixture of various things.
So you think that just shortening text could be more productive?
It could be. I do, as you know, I'm a materials writer as well as a teacher, and I do quite a lot of adapting material for dyslexic learners. Coursebook material and tests. And one thing we do to try and level the playing field is a test. Let's say a test has got 100 questions. The one for the dyslexic learner might have 60. Let's say the text is this long. For the dyslexic learner, it may be this long, etc., etc. I think that's one thing that can help. You don't just randomly cut it. You need to re-edit it and adapt it so that the core content is the same, so that the core language is being looked at, practiced and tested. So as well as just the volume of work, we can also make accommodations in the layout. A lot more space on the page so it looks less daunting. You know, a big, tightly packed page with lots of language can be very daunting for a dyslexic learner.
So spacing, increase the
Exactly,
spacing.
yes. And because of the issues with focus, as well as sort of mental focus, you know, staying on task, there's also an element of focusing on the page. If there's a lot of things happening on the page, the dyslexic learner's eye may be drawn elsewhere, the letters might start to move around, and so on and so on. So spacing on the page, as Paulina just said, literally between your lines, do a double space between the lines, and that will help prevent the eye from being drawn from one line to the next line. It'll help them. The empty space is kind of like a barrier that helps the learner stay focused. A nice friendly layout. A layout with not things jumping around here and here and here, backwards and forwards. A nice linear approach where the learner can, you know, everything is linear, there's no going backwards and forwards, because again, that's where a dyslexic learner could lose their focus.
What about pictures? Should they
Pros and cons, like many things. Pictures can, obviously one of the most useful aids of pictures in ELT material is to help with context, help with comprehension, etc. So for a dyslexic learner that can be a good thing. At the same time, too many pictures, too many busy pictures, a picture in the wrong place on the page could be a distraction. That the dyslexic learner will find themselves looking at the picture and being distracted from the text. So it's a kind of balance, and a lot of this, once you're aware of this, a lot of it is common sense. So pictures, yes, but not very fussy, busy pictures, and kept to a minimum and carefully positioned on the page so they don't interfere with the text.
So it seems that, well, actually they need specific course books. Are there such course books?
To my knowledge, there are no specific course books. And I think this sadly goes down to the fact that there isn't a big enough market for the publisher to produce a nice high quality course book for the dyslexic learner. However, a lot of the major publishers, and maybe some of the other publishers as well, do have on their teachers' resource sites dyslexic friendly material. So let's say you're doing Unit 6 and there's a reading text in the course book. If you go to the teacher's resource site, you may be able to download a dyslexic friendly version of that text and maybe the exercises that go with it as well, so you can give this to your dyslexic learner. But there are no course books to my knowledge. There are books. I wrote a grammar book just for the Italian market, just for Italy, and we produced a dyslexic friendly version of the grammar book. So there are actual books out there, but this is a grammar practice book, and it's just for the Italian market. But to my knowledge, there are no actual course books as such.
Can you name a couple of course books that have these materials for dyslexic people?
Good question. I know OUP. I've done quite a lot of work for OUP. I know they have versions, I think, of Headway, and I think of, I can't remember the titles.
So Oxford University Press.
OUP, I think, have a lot. I'm not sure about the other publishers. I know I've done quite a lot of adapting work for Pearson. Again, off the top of my head, I can't remember the name of the course book. But yeah, I mean, as I said, if you're using a course book, presumably, or hopefully there's a teacher's resource site, go there and they will tell you whether or not they've got it.
And I think it's a nice idea just to ask the staff of the publishers.
Exactly, you can contact them, yes.
People who can consult on.
But it's something that publishers are very, very mindful of, and it's great that more and more are producing material all the time. Okay.
Yeah, and what about memory and memorizing, learning new words, retaining the vocabulary?
That's often a problem for most dyslexic learners, and I say most because some dyslexic, there's no such thing as one dyslexic learner. If we had a room full here of 50 people with dyslexia, the 50 would have overlapping and similar issues, but each one would have their own individual unique issues. So for some, remembering individual words might not be so much of a problem, but they may have problems organising texts and so on. For others, remembering words could be a particular problem. So if we go back to what I said a few minutes ago, that it's working memory and focus, what happens, I suspect, your peers, your non-dyslexic peers, will be learning to spell words and they'll have remembered them and got them fixed, but you're still at the stage of having to phonemically sound out the word. It's not fixed in your internal sight lexicon, which is basically your long-term memory of words, your sort of store of words. We non-dyslexic people, we see a word and we instantly know what it is. Dyslexic learners take a lot longer to get to that stage. For some words, higher frequency words, they'll get quicker. More complex words, it takes longer. So it's basically just, remembering the words just takes a long, long time. You can develop strategies, ways of breaking the words down. For example, when I was at school, to remember how to spell separate, our teachers at primary school said it has a rat in the middle. Rather than ER, AR. Little strategies like that can help the dyslexic learner, but you don't want to over bombard them with too many of these. Again, it's a common sense approach. As a teacher, get to know your individual and get to know their strengths and the areas that they maybe need a little more support. But remembering individual words, that's a problem as well, but that's part of the bigger picture of just fitting them all together and dealing with text and so on and so on.
And what about spelling?
It's the same thing.
It's
the same thing in reverse. We have our, the sort of the inverse of the internal sight lexicon. When we see a word, we instantly know what it is. To us, to non-dyslexic people, you want to spell a word, it's just automatic. You know it, and it just takes a lot longer for a dyslexic person to have that automatic. So instead of phonetic decoding, phonemic decoding when they are reading a word, phonemic coding. When they're spelling a word, they're probably spelling it out as though it's not for the first time, but it's clearly not familiar. I've got something that I used in one of my workshops, a little passage where a dyslexic learner wrote the word would, W-O-U-L-D, and they wrote it in 4 different ways in 4 consecutive sentences. W-O-U-D, then they're thinking there's an L in there, W-O-L-D. So there's an awareness of the spelling, but each time it was approached, it was kind of approached phonemically, separately. 4 different ways in the same, within consecutive sentences. And that kind of an illustration of the problems they have with spelling. This dyslexic learner now knows how to spell would fine, which is great. And what does happen is the dyslexic learner will catch up. So he or she will maybe be behind his non-dyslexic peers in terms of getting the words fixed, getting them in their internal sight lexicon, getting the spellings automatic. But over time, they will catch up. Yeah. Possibly they'll never be perfect spellers, possibly they'll always have issues with spelling, but they will, on the whole, catch up, and there will be possibly no perceptible or really obvious noticeable difference, perhaps when they're in their mid-teens or older teens, perhaps. So it's just a longer, slower process. And this, getting back to what I said at the beginning, is why we need patience and awareness and empathy to help them with that process.
Yeah, well, talking about patience and also motivation, one of my subscribers asked how to empower her teenage dyslexic students to keep on learning after a lot of frustrating previous experience.
That's a very big question, and there isn't one simple answer or solution. It depends on the individual, as I said. Know what works for your individual. Just be as encouraging and supportive as possible. It depends on why they've been frustrated. Have they been having to deal with the same dense, dyslexic, unfriendly texts as their peers? If that's the case, maybe introduce some more dyslexic-friendly, dyslexic designed material, little by little, to just try and show them they can do it and they can succeed and they can be successful. So I think it really does depend on the individual experience of that person, and you have to kind of build on what they've done. But just, again, be supportive as you can, as positive as you can. Use accommodated material if appropriate, and just praise them and just be as positive as you can with them and help them along and try and undo any issues that they've had.
Right, so to summarize, we can say that dyslexic people need shorter text, but the content of the text should be more or less the same as the long.
Yes, I would avoid saying they need that. I'd say it can help for dyslexic learners.
Sense.
Yes,
Yeah, makes sense.
I think, as I said, with the dyslexic learners, because they're all different, we need to avoid being too prescriptive. Try a shorter text with a dyslexic learner. It may be helpful. But yes, carefully adapted so that the core content, so they're not losing out on the content. If it's the LT classroom, so it includes the language which we are teaching and we're practicing and we're recycling, but maybe remove from the text the superfluous text that we perhaps don't really need in terms of content, in terms of language. Try it, and hopefully the dyslexic learner will appreciate it. Double space the lines.
Yeah, so the second, the next one is increase the spacing.
That can help, yes.
Remove all the distractions.
As much as possible, or yes.
And pictures can be helpful, but you should be careful.
They can be helpful, but not too many. Yeah, try and have not them in the island, not in the middle of a text.
Yeah.
Because,
so
maybe above or below the text, or perhaps on a separate piece of paper.
Okay.
So they can use the picture to help with context, etc. But then it's not getting in the way. It's not a temptation when they're actually doing the reading. Yeah. And
then so try and search for already adapted materials in major course books.
Yeah, there's a lot of it and more out there, which is great.
And so one final thing, can you possibly recommend some courses or books or resources, maybe websites?
Well, as we were saying, there are no actual course books, but you can download adapted material. There's a great book by Michele Dall'Osa. I'm not sure how you spell his surname, how you pronounce his surname. He's an Italian expert.
You can later write the name, yes? So
I'll find an exact reference. And he wrote a book about dyslexia in the ELT classroom, and that's an OUP book, and that gives an overview of what it is and lots of practical ideas. That's probably would be my first go-to book. I don't know about other publishers whether they've got them. There are books on general special needs. Again, I know Oxford has got some special needs books, and there will be a chapter or a unit on dyslexia, as well as other related issues like autism and ADHD, etc., etc., etc. Do beware when you're Googling around. As I said, there's some very well-intentioned people out there, but do approach things with a little bit of caution, as we should do in the internet world anyway. But Yes, so the Michele's book is something that I would recommend as a starting point. Yes.
So thank you very much. It's been very insightful. Yeah, and thank
great.
you very
Good.
much for watching.
Good.
The
I
video.
hope that was interesting for you and helpful. Yep.